There is a peculiar paradox in the human heart. We often find ourselves drawn not to those who nourish us, but to those who cannot give us what we most deeply need. It is as if some invisible thread ties us to those who reflect back our own emptiness. We may call it attraction, fate, or destiny, but beneath the surface it is a wound that seeks recognition. The wound does not simply ask to be healed, it asks to be understood, and in the attempt to understand, we may mistake hunger for love, emptiness for intimacy, and silence for acceptance. But there is a reason for this pattern, and if we are willing to look deeply, we will see that the wound that makes us love someone who can give us nothing is also the very wound that can awaken us to our wholeness. The wound is the first teacher. Before we learn to speak, before we know how to shape words into sentences, we have already been shaped by what we were given, and more importantly, by what was withheld. Every human being carries within them the trace of an absence. Moments where affection did not arrive when it was needed, moments when recognition was withheld as if our very being were invisible, moments when love itself seemed to be conditional, given only when we conformed, silenced ourselves, or proved our worth. These are not simply memories, filed away in the distant chambers of the mind. They are living blueprints. They do not remain in the past, they press themselves into our present, whispering into the patterns of our choices, guiding us toward repetition, toward the strange compulsion to seek again and again what was once denied. This is why a man who never felt the warmth of his father's gaze may, without ever intending it, find himself bound to lovers who cannot see him either. This is why a woman who grew up with a mother whose affection came only through perfection may one day discover she is married to a partner who withholds tenderness unless she endlessly performs. The wound does not die with time. It does not lie quietly buried. It becomes a compass, though a broken one, that still insists on pointing. It tells us, here is where the ache is, here is where the longing still breathes, here is where you must return if you wish to feel whole. There is a cruel familiarity in this. The absence feels almost like home, though it hurts. We find ourselves drawn to the very pattern that once harmed us, because the psyche clings to what it knows. A child who has never known unconditional safety does not, as an adult, naturally recognize it. Safety feels alien, almost unsettling. What is familiar is the tension, the doubt, the anxious waiting for affection that may never arrive. And so, in ways hidden from our conscious will, we recreate the original scene of the wound again and again in the hope that this time the ending will be different, that this time the unavailable one will finally turn toward us, that this time the cold eyes will soften, that this time we will be seen. The tragedy, of course, is that we are rarely aware of this repetition. We tell ourselves we are simply in love. We tell ourselves that the difficulty is proof of passion. We tell ourselves that love is supposed to hurt, that longing is part of devotion. But beneath these rationalizations lies something older and deeper. The wound still alive, still calling out, still trying to finish a story that was left unfinished long ago. And yet, to speak of the wound only as tragedy would be to miss its deeper meaning. The wound is not only pain, it is also instruction. It is the first teacher. It teaches us about hunger, about longing, about the raw places in the heart that yearn for touch and recognition. It teaches us what it means to feel incomplete, and therefore what it might mean to seek wholeness. Without the wound, there would be no question, no search, no fire in the soul to move toward transformation. The wound is the crack through which the light insists on entering. Think of how the body responds to an injury. The skin breaks, blood rushes to the surface, and the whole organism begins to repair. Scar tissue forms, stronger than the flesh around it. The body remembers, and in remembering it adapts. So too does the psyche. The wound calls forth our inner resources. It awakens resilience, creativity, and the deep need to make sense of suffering. It is the first teacher because it forces us to ask, why did this happen, and what must I do with it now? The temptation is always to hate the wound, to curse the ache, to believe that life would be better if we had never been hurt. But hatred of the wound only deepens its power. What is resisted does not disappear. It grows stronger, hidden in the shadow. The way forward is not to banish the wound, but to recognize it, to see it not as a cruel enemy, but as a messenger bearing truth about the depths of our being. Without it, we would never know what still aches within us. Without it, we would never be able to look into the mirror of our own history and see clearly what was lost, and therefore what we must learn to give ourselves. Consider the story of a man who, all his life, sought out women who kept him at arm's length. Each time he was convinced that if he could only prove his devotion, if he could only endure the waiting, the coldness, the silence, then love would finally arrive. Years passed, each relationship ending with the same emptiness. At last, through exhaustion, he began to see the pattern. He remembered his childhood, a mother whose warmth came only in fragments, always out of reach. Suddenly it was clear he had been chasing his mother's gaze through the eyes of every woman he loved. The wound was speaking, not the heart, and in this realization something shifted. For the first time he turned the love he had so faithfully given away back toward himself. He began to offer to his own soul what he had begged from others: patience, gentleness, and recognition. This is the work the wound calls us to do. It does not call us merely to suffer, though suffering is part of its path. It calls us to consciousness. It calls us to awaken from the dream of repetition, from the endless cycle of chasing what cannot be found in the old places. It calls us to stand before ourselves with honesty and say, I was wounded, but I am not only the wound. I was denied, but I am not only the denial. I can give to myself what was withheld. I can turn my face toward the light of my own being and find there the presence I once sought in others. The wound is the first teacher because it introduces us to the essential task of being human, to make meaning out of pain, to bring awareness to shadow, to transform what was once broken into the beginning of wholeness. When we can look at our scars not with shame but with reverence, when we can say this hurt me, but it also showed me who I am, then the wound has completed its teaching. It has led us not into despair, but into depth. So when you find yourself drawn to someone who gives you nothing, when you feel the ache of emptiness where you long for love, pause and listen. The wound is speaking. It is not asking you to cling to the unresponsive, nor to lose yourself in scarcity. It is asking you to remember the child who once waited, who once longed, who once believed that love was earned by suffering. It is asking you to hold that child now with the tenderness that was missing then. It is asking you to awaken. The wound is not your enemy. It is your beginning. It is your first teacher. And like all true teachers, its purpose is not to keep you bound, but to lead you beyond itself, into a life where love is no longer a desperate search, but a natural state of being. The emptiness has a strange magnetism. It is not merely absence, it is not simply lack, but something that draws us with a quiet, haunting power. We are pulled toward those who give us nothing because in their silence, in their distance, in their refusal, we feel a strange familiarity. The empty vessel becomes a canvas, and into it we pour our devotion, our tenderness, our yearning, as though we might fill it to the brim and in return find ourselves filled. The fantasy arises almost unconsciously. If I can love them enough, if I can give more, endure more, forgive more, they will one day turn toward me. They will finally love me back. This illusion gives us a sense of purpose, and purpose is intoxicating. But it is a dangerous intoxication, because it binds us to an endless striving in which we give and give, yet never truly receive. One might wonder why such patterns persist in so many lives, why otherwise intelligent and self-aware people find themselves returning again and again to the same barren fields, planting seeds where nothing will ever grow. The answer lies not in reason, but in the unconscious. Beneath the surface, we are not trying to love this particular person, but rather to complete a story left unfinished in the distant past. The friend who stays in a one-sided relationship, always sending the first message, always planning the outings, always carrying the weight of connection, is not merely practicing loyalty. What they are really doing is staging a ritual, repeating the ancient script of the wound. They are trying to win love where love has always been absent, to change the ending that once left them shattered and unseen. On the surface, such devotion may look noble. To outsiders it appears as selfless love, an admirable patience, a saintly endurance. But beneath this noble mask lies despair, for to love someone who gives nothing is not to practice virtue, but to reenact bondage. It is not freedom, but compulsion. The allure of emptiness lies precisely in this. It tempts us with the hope of rewriting our history. We believe that if this one person can finally love us, then all the past denials, all the cold silences, all the wounds of childhood will be erased. But this is the lie of repetition. The past cannot be undone by repeating it. Repetition is not healing, it is imprisonment. Consider the story of a woman who devotes years of her life to a man who cannot commit. Each time he withdraws, she doubles her effort, believing that her love can bridge the gap. She tells herself that he is simply afraid, that he needs time, that if she is patient enough, he will change. She does not see that his indifference is not a temporary obstacle, but the very structure of their bond. Her loyalty is not to him, but to the unconscious hope that at last she might heal the wound of her father's absence, the father who never fully arrived for her in childhood. The emptiness of the partner is alluring because it mirrors the emptiness she once knew, and the child within still believes, if I keep trying, if I give more, if I become worthy, then this time love will come. And yet, the tragedy is that love sought in this way never comes. The empty vessel remains empty, no matter how much is poured into it, and so the giver grows exhausted, depleted, hollowed out. The endless giving does not produce intimacy, but erodes the self. What began as hope becomes despair. What began as devotion becomes self-abandonment. Still, even in this despair, the allure remains strong. For the soul resists letting go of the fantasy that it might finally complete what was left undone. This allure must be understood, not condemned. To judge ourselves harshly for loving the unavailable is to miss the deeper truth. The psyche does not choose this path out of foolishness, but out of necessity. It seeks healing, even if the path it chooses cannot lead there. It is like a thirsty wanderer in the desert, mistaking a mirage for water. The thirst is real, the longing is true, but the image is an illusion. To understand the allure of emptiness is to recognize the desperation of the heart, the hunger of the soul, the depth of the wound that drives us to pour ourselves into vessels that cannot hold us. The danger of this allure is not only that we are left unloved, but that in the process we lose sight of our own worth. Each time love is withheld, we turn the blame inward. We tell ourselves we are not enough, not beautiful enough, not patient enough, not worthy enough. We cling harder, hoping to prove our value, while the silence of the other deepens our self-doubt. Studies on unreciprocated love show that those who remain in such dynamics often suffer higher rates of anxiety, depression, and feelings of worthlessness. This is not simply the pain of heartbreak. it is the corrosion of the self. The allure of emptiness does not only keep us chasing the unavailable, it also convinces us that we are undeserving of the mutuality we truly crave. Yet, paradoxically, it is precisely through this confrontation with emptiness that transformation becomes possible. When we finally recognize that no amount of giving will awaken love in one who cannot love, when we finally see that pouring ourselves into an empty vessel only leaves us drained, then we stand at a threshold. We can either continue repeating the cycle, or we can pause, look into the mirror of our own longing, and ask, what is it I am truly seeking? Whose love am I still chasing? What part of me still waits at the door of the past, hoping to be welcomed home? In that moment of recognition, the allure begins to lose its power. We see the emptiness for what it is, not a promise of healing, but a repetition of wounding. And in that clarity, a new possibility emerges. To take the love we have so freely poured into the unreachable other and redirect it inward, to the child within us who has waited far too long for someone to arrive. The emptiness of the other can become the mirror that reflects us back to ourselves. The allure of emptiness, then, is both a danger and a gift. It reveals the places within us that still hunger, the ancient wounds that still ache, the unfinished stories that still seek completion. It shows us the persistence of the human heart, its refusal to give up on love even in the face of absence. And if we are willing to see clearly, it can also show us the path forward. To stop chasing what cannot be given, to cease pouring into vessels that remain empty, and to begin offering to ourselves the very love we have so long sought outside. It is not easy to break the spell. Emptiness is seductive precisely because it resembles the past, and the past is deeply etched into the soul. But when we begin to see, when we begin to listen, when we dare to stop repeating and start healing, then the allure of emptiness is no longer a prison. It becomes instead the doorway to awakening, the moment when we realize that the love we give is not wasted, but waiting to be turned inward, where it can finally fill the vessel that was never meant to remain empty, our own heart. When we fall in love with someone who gives us nothing, it is tempting to believe that we are enthralled by their mystery, their aloofness, or their indifference. Yet the truth lies deeper. So often we are not loving them at all. We are loving a part of ourselves that we have hidden away, a piece of our own soul that we do not dare to claim. What appears to be desire for another is frequently desire for reunion with the self. The psyche, in its strange wisdom, projects outward what it cannot yet accept inward, and so we mistake our own reflection for another's face. Projection is one of the most subtle and deceptive forces within us. It is the mind's way of handling what feels too heavy, too unknown, or too threatening to acknowledge as our own. Instead of confronting it directly, we cast it onto another, and there it comes alive before our eyes. When you are seized by longing for someone who is cold and distant, you may think you are fascinated by their silence, by their reserve, by the way they stand apart. But in truth, what ignites the fire within you is not their absence of warmth, but your belief that you could be the one to awaken it. You are not in love with their indifference. You are in love with the possibility of dissolving it. That possibility is not theirs, it is yours. It is your own tenderness, your own devotion, your own warmth, repressed and unclaimed, appearing before you as if it belonged to someone else. The heart is easily deceived in this way. You may look at the distant lover and say, if I could only melt their walls, if I could only soften their silence, then my love would be fulfilled. What you do not see is that the walls are not theirs alone, they are also yours. The silence that disturbs you is not just the silence between you, but the silence within you where your own tenderness has gone unheard. To project is to live in a dream, to encounter fragments of yourself disguised as the other, and to believe you are chasing them when, in truth, you are chasing what has been lost within. It is no small thing to awaken from such dreams. The illusion of projection is powerful because it offers hope. It whispers, here in this other person lies the key to your fulfillment. Here is the love you crave, the devotion you lack, the wholeness you seek. And yet, again and again, the promise goes unfulfilled. The person remains distant, or they withdraw, or they reveal themselves incapable of carrying what you have placed upon them. Each disappointment is not only about them. It is also about the collapse of the dream, the reminder that what you are looking for cannot be found outside. But if we have the courage to see through the illusion, projection can become a profound teacher. Imagine recognizing that the love you seek in the other is actually the unclaimed love of your own heart. Imagine realizing that the devotion you long for is the devotion you have withheld from yourself. Such recognition is liberating, for it breaks the spell of helplessness. You no longer need to beg for what is already within you. You no longer need to stand outside the locked door of another's heart, waiting to be invited in. Instead, you turn inward, and there you find the hidden warmth you once projected outward. Think of a person who spends years pursuing cold, unavailable partners, believing each time that they can awaken the sleeping heart of the other. They give everything only to find themselves empty-handed. Eventually, the pattern becomes undeniable. In a moment of clarity, they see that the attraction was never to the partner's indifference, but to the fantasy of transforming it. The warmth they were seeking was not trapped in the other. It was trapped in themselves, unrecognized, unexpressed. The unavailability of the partner mirrored the unavailability they had to their own soul. When this recognition dawns, a shift occurs. Instead of pouring all their tenderness into an empty vessel, they begin to direct it inward, learning to nurture, to care for, to acknowledge themselves. The energy that once fed a futile pursuit now becomes the fire of inner healing. Projection is not limited to romantic love. It permeates all human relationships. The admiration you feel for someone's strength may be your own strength unclaimed. The envy you feel toward another's success may be the echo of your own unlived potential. The irritation you feel at another's weakness may be the shadow of your own denied fragility. To live unconsciously is to swim in these projections, mistaking them for objective reality. To live consciously is to reclaim them, to recognize the pieces of yourself wherever they appear, and to integrate them back into the whole. This work is not easy because it requires humility. It requires us to say, what I thought was theirs is also mine. What I accused them of withholding is what I have withheld from myself. What I admired in them is what I must now cultivate within. Such admissions dismantle pride, but they open the doorway to truth. For in the end, we do not grow by clinging to illusions. We grow by seeing through them, and so, when you find yourself loving someone who cannot love you back, pause and listen. Ask yourself, what have I placed upon them that belongs to me? What qualities do I see in them that are really fragments of my own soul? What part of myself am I longing to recover? The answers will not come quickly nor easily, but they will come. And when they do, the grip of projection will loosen, and what once felt like a prison will become an opening. The beauty of this process is that it does not diminish love. It deepens it. To reclaim your projections is not to stop loving, but to love more wisely, more fully, more truly. Instead of chasing shadows, you begin to love with clarity. You no longer confuse the other with your own reflection. You no longer demand that they carry what belongs to you. You see them as they are, not as a screen for your hidden longings. And from that place of clarity, true relationship becomes possible. For only when we stop using others to find ourselves can we finally meet them as they are. Projection is the veil that hides us from ourselves, but it is also the bridge that leads us back. Every time you fall in love with someone who gives you nothing, every time you ache for a tenderness that never comes, you are being shown the very tenderness you must now awaken within yourself. The other is not your savior, not your jailer, not even your true beloved. They are the mirror, reflecting back to you the parts of yourself you must claim in order to be whole. To see this clearly is to break the spell. To act upon it is to step into freedom. To love someone who gives you nothing is to step into a slow dissolving of your own being. At first it does not appear so. In the beginning there is the thrill of pursuit, the intoxication of hope, the subtle belief that if you are patient enough, loyal enough, devoted enough, you will finally unlock the heart that refuses to open. It feels noble, almost holy, as though your endurance is a proof of love's strength. But beneath this illusion, something fragile is being consumed. What is lost is not only time or opportunity. What is lost is the quiet foundation of the self. It is a slow erosion, a steady leaking away of spirit, so gradual that you do not notice it until one day you find yourself hollow, emptied of vitality, and unsure of who you are. The erosion happens in small increments. You silence your needs to avoid burdening them. You lower your expectations again and again, telling yourself not to ask for too much. You apologize for your longings as if they were crimes. You remain waiting for the call that does not come, the affection that does not arrive, the recognition that never appears. Each act of waiting seems minor, but together they carve away at your sense of worth, as water carves stone. You begin to believe that your role in love is to prove yourself, to audition endlessly for the part of being worthy, without ever being granted the role. Science itself has traced the marks of this slow diminishment. Studies of unreciprocated love reveal not only the predictable sadness of rejection, but deeper wounds, heightened levels of anxiety, depressive symptoms, a collapse of self-esteem. The body bears the cost too: sleep disturbances, lowered immunity, physical exhaustion. But beyond the psychological and physical toll, there is a deeper affliction, one that data alone cannot capture. It is the spiritual pain of feeling unworthy of mutual care, the gnawing conviction that intimacy is not meant for you, that love is something always withheld, always out of reach. This is not simply heartbreak. It is the quiet theft of your own belief in yourself. The danger is subtle because it masquerades as devotion. You tell yourself that your persistence proves loyalty, that your willingness to endure proves strength. But endurance without reciprocity is not love. It is self-abandonment. It is the soul turning against itself, feeding its energy into an abyss that never returns nourishment. And the more you give, the less you recognize your own face. You begin to identify yourself not as a being worthy of love, but as a being who must endlessly strive for crumbs of affection. The danger, then, is not only in losing the other, but in losing yourself entirely. I have known people who, in the name of love, have erased themselves. One woman gave up her art, her friends, her laughter, all in the hope that her silence would make her partner stay. She believed that if she became small enough, undemanding enough, he would finally notice her devotion. But the more she diminished, the less visible she became. In trying not to lose him, she lost herself, until at last there was nothing left of her own essence to offer. The irony is sharp. The attempt to secure love by dissolving the self-guarantees that true love will never be possible. For love cannot grow where there is no one left to receive it. To notice this erosion requires deep honesty. It asks you to confront the painful truth that not all giving is holy, not all sacrifice is virtuous. Sometimes sacrifice is disguised despair. Sometimes giving is not love but fear. The fear of being abandoned, the fear of facing your own emptiness, the fear of discovering that you do not believe yourself worthy of more. To continue in such giving is to abandon your soul at the altar of another's indifference. The human spirit is resilient, but it is not inexhaustible. You cannot pour endlessly into a vessel that never holds you. To do so is to drain your own inner well, until bitterness replaces tenderness and resentment replaces devotion. Then you are left not only with the absence of the other's love, but with the ashes of your own heart. This is the hidden cost of self-erosion. You lose the possibility of love both from them and from yourself. And yet the awareness of this danger can itself be the beginning of healing. When you begin to notice that love has become self-abandonment, when you begin to ask whether the waiting and striving are nourishing or destroying you, then the erosion slows. You begin to reclaim the parts of yourself that you surrendered. You remember your laughter, your creativity, your friendships, the very things that once made you whole. Slowly you turn back toward yourself, and in doing so you discover that the love you thought you needed from another was in its truest form the love you had to learn to give yourself. It is important to see that to preserve yourself is not selfishness. To guard your spirit is not betrayal. There is no virtue in dissolving into nothingness for the sake of someone who will not hold you. Love is not meant to consume the self, but to enrich it. True love magnifies who you are. It does not erase you. When you feel yourself vanishing in the presence of another, it is not love but illusion that you are serving. The danger of self-erosion is real and profound, but it is not final. The same energy that once poured outward into the unresponsive other can be redirected inward, where it will bear fruit. What you once gave away in desperation can become what you now give yourself in devotion. What once dissolved, you can become what rebuilds you. And when you stand in your own fullness again, when you recognize that you do not need to vanish in order to be loved, then love itself changes. It is no longer a desperate search for worth. It becomes the meeting of two beings who are already whole. The task, then, is vigilance of the soul, to ask yourself honestly, am I still present in this love, or am I fading? Do I recognize myself here, or have I surrendered too much of who I am? Love will always require risk, patience, and sacrifice, but it should never require the annihilation of the self. When you sense that your spirit is leaking away, that the light within you is dimming, it is time to turn back. For the greatest tragedy is not losing another, it is losing yourself. And the greatest act of love you can ever offer, both to yourself and to others, is to remain whole. Paradox is the language of the soul, and nowhere is it more evident than in the way our deepest wounds become the seeds of our liberation. The very wound that draws us into emptiness, that entangles us in longing for those who cannot love us back, is also the wound that can reveal the path to freedom. At first this seems impossible. How can the source of our suffering become the key to our healing? How can the very place where we have been most abandoned become the place where we might awaken? And yet, again and again, this is how the psyche moves. What begins as affliction becomes initiation. What begins as despair becomes revelation. The wound does not speak in the language of punishment, but in the language of instruction. It tells us, here is where you were denied, here is where your hunger was left unmet, here is where you have mistaken absence for love. And in that recognition lies choice. For the first time we can see clearly what was hidden. We can stop repeating the old cycle, stop chasing shadows, stop offering our essence to those who will never receive it. The wound, when brought into awareness, becomes not a chain but a doorway. It invites us to turn inward and to reparent the neglected child within, the child who once cried for affection and was met with silence, the child who once longed to be seen and was ignored. To reparent ourselves is to offer now, with conscious intention, the love, presence, and affirmation we once sought from others in vain. Imagine a person who has given years of their life to an unresponsive partner. Every gesture of affection was met with indifference, every attempt at closeness with withdrawal. They poured themselves out until they were empty, believing that if they gave enough, one day it would be enough. And then, one day, a moment of clarity arrives. They recognize the futility, they see the pattern, they feel the exhaustion of a heart that has given endlessly into nothingness. With trembling courage, they choose to leave. At first there is grief, a terrible silence, the disorientation of no longer having someone to chase. But slowly, something begins to shift. Instead of waiting by the phone, they begin to explore their own interests. They take up painting again, or traveling, or learning something that sparks curiosity. They rediscover the joy of companionship in friendships, the freedom of solitude, the exhilaration of becoming themselves once more. Over time, they come to see that the love they gave so freely was never wasted. It was not lost. It was simply misplaced. The abundance they once poured into someone incapable of receiving it can now be redirected, first into their own growth, and then into relationships where love is alive, reciprocal, and nourishing. This is the hidden gift of the wound, awakening. Without the ache of unreciprocated love, we would never have been forced to look inward. Without the pain of emptiness, we would never have recognized our own fullness. Without the endless striving to be chosen, we would never have realized that the one who must choose us first is ourselves. The wound exposes our illusions, strips us of false hopes, and, in its harshness, prepares us for a deeper truth, that love is not meant to be begged for. It is meant to be shared, reciprocated, and multiplied. In this sense, the wound becomes the birthplace of discernment. Once you have known the ache of giving everything and receiving nothing, you begin to recognize more quickly when a relationship is unbalanced. You can feel the difference between love that nourishes and love that drains. The soul, once burned, becomes wiser. It develops an instinct for reciprocity, a sensitivity to authenticity. This does not mean you will never suffer again, but it does mean you will suffer with greater awareness, and that awareness is what transforms pain into growth. I have seen people who, after years of chasing the unavailable, finally awaken to their own worth and step into relationships of profound depth. At first, they cannot quite believe it. The tenderness of mutual care feels foreign, almost overwhelming, because they have been so accustomed to absence. But slowly, they learn to trust it. They learn to receive as well as to give. And in doing so, they discover that the very wound that once left them starving has prepared them to appreciate love in its fullness. Had they never suffered the wound, they might have taken love for granted. But because they have known the desert, they can now recognize the miracle of water. The wound also teaches us compassion. To have been broken is to understand the fragility of the human heart. When you have suffered neglect, you can see more clearly the suffering of others. You become gentler, less quick to judge, more capable of holding space for another's pain. What was once your prison becomes your bridge to others. You no longer stand apart from human suffering. You are connected to it, and therefore more capable of loving deeply. And perhaps the greatest gift of the wound is the way it calls forth our creative power. Out of pain we make meaning. Out of emptiness we create beauty. Many of the world's greatest works of art, literature, and philosophy were born from the attempt to transmute suffering into something enduring. The wound demands that we give it shape, that we find language, music, images, or actions through which to express what cannot remain silent. In doing so, we discover that the wound is not only something that happens to us, it is something we can transform. It becomes a source of strength, of insight, of creation. To see the wound as gift does not mean to romanticize suffering. It does not mean to seek it out or to remain in it unnecessarily. The pain is real, the loss is real, the despair is real. But what it means is that suffering need not be the final word. The wound can be the crack that lets the light in, the fracture that opens the heart to a deeper love, the emptiness that teaches us to find fullness within. It means that even in our darkest experiences, there is hidden potential for awakening if only we are willing to listen, to learn, to turn inward rather than outward. And so, the wound that once drew you into emptiness may one day be the very thing that leads you home. It teaches you not to waste yourself on those who cannot love you, but to honor the love you already carry. It shows you that the tenderness you sought outside is alive within you, waiting to be acknowledged. It reminds you that you are not broken, only human, and that humanity itself is the soil out of which true love grows. When this truth becomes clear, the wound is no longer a chain, but a gift, no longer a curse, but a calling. It has done its work, not by destroying you, but by awakening you to the fullness of who you are and to the kind of love that truly nourishes the soul. The wound that makes you love someone who can give you nothing is not a curse. It is a mirror. It reveals where you still hunger, where you still ache, and where you still mistake emptiness for intimacy. But if you dare to look into that mirror, not with shame but with courage, you will find that the wound has always carried within it the medicine. The medicine is self-awareness, self-compassion, and the radical choice to love where love can truly grow. In the end, the wound is not the end of love. It is the beginning of learning how to love rightly, fully, and without losing yourself.